everyone. I think people are still coming in from the waiting room, but we are happy to have you here. I think I know everyone, but Kelsey Erickson-Streufert with the Texas Restaurant Association, Wendy and Charles are here as well, our executive committee members. And anyone is welcome to turn their video on if they're in a place to do so. This really is set up as a meeting to hear from y'all, not just listen to us. So let's make it as interactive as we can. We are recording. We will share the recording with our members. Please don't share it beyond E4C members, because this really is our internal deliberations to really help us nail down what are those bill ideas and priority topics that we want to lean into and really lead as the Employers for Childcare Task Force. So with all that said, I've got a presentation. So let me share that. All right, everyone's seeing one slide on the screen, hopefully. Perfect. Okay, let's dive right in. So normal housekeeping, please don't share this beyond E4C. This is closed to media, off the record. We shouldn't have any media folks on here, but I always just say that because I'm a lawyer and I'm paranoid. And we will share all this with our members afterwards. All my members are laughing because they know that to be true. So we don't have a super long agenda today. Really, the goal is pretty straightforward. We want to share with y'all some of the employer partnership ideas that we've been talking about internally and really get y'all's feedback on what would be most helpful. How do we need to draft these things to make sure that real life employers can actually utilize these tools? And really just get your feedback. So as we're presenting different options to the legislature and the legislature is presenting different options to us, we have y'all's real world feedback onto what works, what doesn't, and we can bear that in mind at the Capitol. So with that, let's dig in. Wanted to start, especially for those who couldn't be here in the last meeting, with just a refresher on the 5 kind of priority topics that we're looking at for session. And remember, we're not necessarily going to have a bill on each one of these items. In some instances, we're going to be working with other groups in collaboration on a bill. In some instances, it's playing defense. It's making sure that other bills don't pass that go against these priorities. In some instances, it might be a budget rider, meaning either funding or instructions to an agency in the budget. But these are the 5 things that we're going to kind of keep coming back to. And as we hear from other folks with different ideas, we're going to ask ourselves, does that idea, even if it sounds good or bad, how does it fit in with what we've said our priorities are? And that's really important at the Capitol because there's a lot of great ideas out there, but there's only 140 days in session and only about 16% of the laws that are introduced actually pass. So we have to really stay focused on what it is that we're trying to prioritize versus every good idea that comes along. So I'm not going to read these. Y'all are capable of reading the slides, but just kind of the headlines are employer partnerships, which is what we're going to dig in today. Data, which is really Charles's area of expertise. Regulations, not necessarily more or less regulations, but making sure we have the right regulations and they're consistently applied. Childcare workforce, making sure that our childcare providers actually have teachers who can be in the classroom and serve kids. And then governance. How do we make sure that moving forward, there is a streamlined system, there's true accountability, and we know who's making decisions about our childcare infrastructure. Any questions about these 5 before we dig into the details? Great. Okay, we will keep moving forward then. Okay, so here's really the meat of today's meeting. We've got at least 4 employer partnership ideas that we want to talk through with y'all and hopefully really get your feedback about what would work, what wouldn't work, how we need to structure these, etc. So the first that I think has been pretty popular with everyone is this idea of a resource hub. How do we help employers of all sizes get information about childcare, best practices, ideas, resources they can share with their employees, those types of things. So I just dropped some questions in here to kind of start the discussion. I always think about this being online at the Texas Workforce Commission's website because they're kind of the most attached to childcare at the moment, and employers are already used to working with the Workforce Commission. Employees less so, to be honest. But I think the goal here really is to connect employers so that they can then be conduits for their employees. I just threw out a bunch of ideas we could include on that resource hub, but certainly would love y'all's feedback on other things that should be there. And then, kind of two offset questions. One, how do we really maximize the impact of something like this? You have all heard horror stories of government programs and benefits that really didn't have their intended impact because people didn't know about them. So how do we really make sure that this is something that the public knows about, that employers know about, so that people actually go there and use these items? And then kind of the inverse of that is, how do we make sure that this isn't a big expense for the state? We all know that that can really kill an idea at the Capitol. I think there's ways to do this where, we're talking about maintaining a website. There's a lot of employees at TWC. Hopefully that's something they can kind of do with their existing employee count and resources. But those are the types of questions that we wanted to throw out and see if y'all have any feedback for how we should be thinking about this resource hub idea. Any
Hey,
thoughts?
Kelsey,
Yeah.
what do you envision, like what kind of information would the resource hub have? Like if I'm an employer, an employee comes to me and says, hey, I want to work more hours, but I need childcare, I need help. So then as an employer, I would then go to TWC, to this hub website, and I would look to see like what resources are available.
I think that's part of the idea. Yes, Lupita. So a couple things there. One, you can find resources to share with your employee. Two, as an employer, you can find resources that for things that you might want to do for your workforce. So sorry if y'all can hear my dogs barking. So for example, right now, and Charles, you actually know more about this than me, but there are federal tax-free savings accounts that can be set up, kind of like your HSA type situation, right? And so that's something that an employer could set up for their employees to help them pay for childcare. Most employers don't know anything about that. So that's an example of information that could be shared. Not something you would have to do, but something that if you knew about, you might be more interested in rolling out. Charles, any better thoughts
Just
on
as an
that?
example of that, I went to my employer last year and said, you can do this, because they weren't. And they said, oh, sure, that's really cool. We didn't even know this existed, but you have to opt into it and ask your benefits counselor or whoever has that set up to do it. And then your employees can get, $5,000 or $10,000 of basically tax-free money to spend on childcare.
Wow. Okay.
Any other thoughts on things that should be on that website or ways to make that website more helpful, especially for employers?
So I just have this is Lucinda Saxon. I'm brand new to the group, so sorry. I'm going to probably be asking very basic questions, but I'm thinking about, I know the Workforce Commission has this they're doing a big redesign of their whole system, and now is probably a great time for them to know that this is something that we're talking about. And Tom McCarty is running that program, right? And that redesign. But then also the Department of Information Resource is putting together an app for kind of all state agencies to use for their constituent services. If on outreach, it might be interesting to see if they're working with the Workforce Commission and see if we can
Lucinda, you're
tag team there to put childcare information. Oh,
I hear you now. I think it's working now.
okay. Sorry, that was just a thought to see if DIR's app would work with the Workforce Commission and see if that's another way to push information out to employers and to just general employees as well.
That's great, Lucinda. Not dumb questions at all. Really good insights. I made a note to follow up with you, so we can learn more about what's happening now and how we can plug into that. Because I agree, if we can work with them before they've rolled out some whole new system, that might go a long way to minimizing the cost and making it work better. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Hey, Charles, why don't employers know about those resources? I mean, why hasn't, why, I mean, that just sounds like an incredible program that everyone should know about. Who's not sharing this information and why isn't it being shared?
There, these are all
I'm an
kind of through the
employer. I
tax-
had no idea about that. Never heard about that one time.
They're hidden in the tax code, and there's all sorts of benefits that you can or may or may not opt into as an employer. And the people who kind of should be telling you that are probably your benefits consultants or whoever. If you have a integrated HR and benefits company, if you're using one of those are the folks who should be getting that information out to you. Some of the companies that do this don't want to do it because it's more administrative hassle for them. But there's all kinds of changes to the tax code that happen all the time. These accounts were expanded during early pandemic as part of those laws. And so before, it might not have been in an amount that folks thought was worthwhile, but with the expanded availability, it's having more of an impact. But yeah, I think the basic reason of why people don't know is that these things are complicated. They're changing all the time, and it's a lot to keep up with.
Charles, what is the name of that benefit?
It's a dependent care flexible savings account. So I've seen it abbreviated DFSA.
Okay.
The other thing too is many of y'all know there's going to be a big tax package negotiated next year in Capitol Hill. There's already some proposals to do more in the childcare space, create more tax incentives and that sort of thing. So that's looking down in the future. But if there are more of those incentives, this could be a great place to really let employers know about it. Because Lupita, to your point, these federal programs are created and they kind of get lost in translation. But if we have a centralized source to really push out this information, that's really employers are the audience. I think that's one thing that's been missing is the childcare resources have always targeted individual families and nonprofits that serve families. There haven't been a lot of communications that are directly aimed at employers to get to their employees, right? And so that's a gap that I think this could help fill.
And you know, we have companies all the time that reach out to us about WOTC, about WOTC, and they're constantly calling us, hey, there's this wonderful program, and we do WOTC, but gosh, why aren't they tagging on this the DFSA program as well and say, oh, by the way, there's this other incredible program that you could take advantage of. So it almost maybe needs to be full circle, like some of these programs that some of these companies that do WOTC maybe need to also have this information. But I guess as employers, if we're given this information, then we can talk to them about it and say, hey, what do you know about this? And how can we be a part of it?
So again, as an employer, what I was going to say is, Charles mentioned that, these benefit package companies are supposed to tell us, okay, again, we don't have a benefits package company. So, and again, I think that's very indicative of a lot of particularly restaurant employers. We don't, we have online payroll and we're getting that payroll from a software, and it's, as bare bones as possible. And a lot of times it's coming from the POS provider. So like right now, Toast has got the market share and they're the payroll provider. So, what is Toast going to tell you about benefits packages? Nothing. So that is, so I do think, like, I'm looking at the Texas Child Care Connection website right now, and of course they have a place for you know, families, and they have a place for providers, and there's literally nothing on there for employers.
Yep. That exact thought has occurred to me too, Janie.
Also, as an industry specific idea, having a lot of this available for Texas Restaurant Association members would be a massive value add and something that would, I think, help drive membership.
I totally agree, Janie. And I think whether it's TRA, whether it's your local chamber of commerce, there's a lot of opportunities for membership groups to help spread this information. You know, we do our webinars and podcasts, and I mean, I could see a webinar on, you know, some of these tax credit programs, for example.
Yeah, and like even like local cities, I don't even think it's a chamber of commerce, but like Plano, the city of Plano, for example, like they're always offering us free tutorials on social media. And it's like, I don't, you know, city of Plano offer business owners tutorials on childcare benefits. Like that would be much more helpful. So I don't even know if there's a way to get some of these bigger city jurisdictions involved in educating business owners as well.
Agreed. All right, we're going to keep moving because we've got 3 others in this bucket to talk through, but keep the ideas flowing. There's good commentary happening in the chat too. So the second sort of item is the tri-share model, which we talked about quite a bit in our last meeting, but want to drill down on really how much y'all would be able to utilize something like this. You know, one potential con that I've flagged before is the whole concept of this is the employer and the employee are putting up money and then the state is matching it. So if the employer cannot afford to put up money for that person's childcare, the program doesn't really work, right? And I know in this economy, especially, lots of employers do not have extra money set aside for a benefit program like this. At the same time, especially for like my restaurant members, how many employees do you have at a single time that would need to benefit from something like this, right? You only have so many employees who are needing childcare at any one time. So maybe that helps make the cost more doable. I don't know. That's really where we need this group to tell us, is that a barrier, or is that something that you can overcome given the scale and given how many employees we're talking about here? Does that make sense? That question felt a little rambly.
For me, hi, this is Blanca.
Hey, Blanca.
I'm at a point where I do have most of my employees don't have children anymore. So just a few of them will have 1 or 2, but definitely when one of them gets sick, they are not able to attend. So I would be most definitely interested in doing something like this. But to my scale, mine is minimal at this point.
So that's helpful, Blanca, because you're a 1 unit operator, right? So that's part of what we want to think about here is, do these solutions work for single unit small businesses all the way up to larger businesses, right? We don't want to have a solution that only helps one type of business.
I would think that, you know, I'm hopeful that the economy is going to get better, that food cost, labor cost, insurance, taxes are going to, at some point, either stabilize or go down. I mean, I have to believe that it's not going to continue the way that it is. I think right now, most restaurants are, well, I'm not going to say most because I can't speak for everyone, but I know for us, it's a difficult time but I also am struggling with trying to find good long-term employees. So, you know, there may be some things that I have to really look at and say, okay, you know, I can't afford to do this in all 70 locations right now. because cost wise, it just is not going to work. But if I have some really good employees that have been with me for a while, then I'm going to be willing to look at that kind of investment in them, because in the long run, that's really going to help us as well. So, I think affordability is a difficult situation for most restaurants right now, just because of the state of the economy. But like I said, I'm hopeful that things will turn around at some point.
Yeah, Lupita, I think that brings up a good point, which is it might be more useful for employers if they can put some parameters around which employees qualify. So for example, could you only make it available to employees who have been with you for at least 6 months or a year? Or could you only make it available to, I mean, obviously they'd have to be non-discriminatory factors, but could you put in some parameters like that so it didn't have to be all or nothing? That might make it more feasible for an employer to use it, is one of the points I took away from that.
Yeah, that's correct. We'd have to, yeah. And I think every employer would want to do that. Had you asked me this prior to COVID, when things were a lot different, I would have said, oh, this is a no-brainer. We need to be doing this. Yes, let's do it. But right now, I think until things get better for restaurants, I mean, every time I talk to a restaurateur, so many of them are struggling with different, with food, with labor, with, their insurance is doubled, tripled in some cases, and it's just a difficult time, sadly. But yes, I think in some cases it may be worth the investment if it's somebody who's going to be with you or who has been with you long term, who you think, okay, this person, I could see them moving into an assistant manager or restaurant manager position. I'm willing to make the investment.
Yep, that makes total sense to me. I've always said, we all want to do good things in this space, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't really matter, right? So that's really why we need y'all's feedback and your honesty to say, this sounds great, but it's just not something I can't afford, or I can, right? That's the feedback we need. So thank you.
So I have a question, Kelsey,
Yeah, Jamie.
for just normal round number sake. It's the tri-share model would be, I put forth $500, my employee puts forth $500, and the state puts forth $500.
Wendy, why don't you jump into that? I think it's been done differently in different places.
It has. So I think there's opportunity to shape that a little bit, Janie, but I think essentially the idea is, I think in some places it's been a percentage, but what we heard from employers was that putting a percentage in locked them in to something that they actually got financially couldn't afford 6 months later. So I think a dollar amount is probably what we're hearing from other states, and what we've heard from the Dallas Regional Chamber, who's been looking into this, makes more sense. And that it would be, I think of it more, tri-share is what it has been called, but I think of it more like a matching program where an employer would say, okay, I'm going to put in up to, I can put in up to X number of dollars, but I can actually only do $100 a month, but $100 still is going to draw down $100 from the state. And so then that's $200 that is going towards the childcare. The family is going to have to assume everything else beyond that. So even if it was $1,000 a month, that's still $200 sort of deducted from their total cost, is how that's how I like to think about it.
Does this go directly to the family, or does it go to is it paid from the state and from the employer to a childcare facility?
It's been done in different ways, and we can shape that. Again, that's sort of an area that we can determine what we would like to do. I think one way that has happened is through a hub model. There's an entity that is set up. It's a nonprofit. It's an existing entity that houses all of this and does all of the admin for it. To pull it together from the employer, to pull it down from the state, and then to try to do the matching with the family. The hope with that hub actually is even more than just giving them and like giving them, helping apply the money to them. But the hope is that the hub is actually helping the families try to find quality childcare, figure out what quality actually is, see if they're eligible for other, family childcare efforts from TWC. So the idea would be that the hub actually can be more outward facing to the families to help them figure out how they use that money in a really smart way.
So, to answer your question then, Kelsey, the problem is that like, again, and I know this is I can only speak from my own industry, which is very different, but the problem is that $500 for an employee, for me to contribute that to their childcare is very difficult. It's also very difficult for that employee to contribute $500. And then if the state is only matching that and it's $1,500, it's still not enough, So this is where it's like, I think it does have to be more meaningful than that. So, maybe, and I don't even know if this is possible, but maybe they match it ×2. But then of course, in order for that not to get abused, I can totally see it only, being paid directly to the accredited childcare center, what have you. But again, only from my, I don't know, Lupita, if you would agree with that, but it's still, I mean, y'all know childcare is so expensive, and I know we haven't gotten there yet, but it's almost like they also need to subsidize what they're having to pay their childcare workers. I know we haven't gotten there yet, but it's like if it came from both ends, both my matching and the cost for a facility to actually get there and have workers and pay them and all of those things, if it came from both ends, I feel like that'd be a solution. But at any rate, from the exact tri-share question that we asked, it would be challenging for us to do more than $500 a month. It would be challenging for us to do $500 a month, and it still doesn't seem like that would really be get them there.
For what it's worth, Jane. So I think I really appreciate that feedback. And I think for what it's worth, the saying that $500 a month. So we know, I'll just take the average amount that I know is that it costs about $1,000 a month for childcare. And that depends, where you're looking, and depends on the age of the child, but on average, $1,000 a month, or a little bit less, maybe call $800 to $1,000 a month. I think $500 a month is quite generous in that sort of formula. And so I think it's good feedback, and it's also helping me think through like, one, this is all opt-in, right? This would never be a requirement. It's just like an option for employers if they wanted to take advantage of this. But I think the question Kelsey and I have been wrestling with is like, is this something that the restaurant like we can see the other industries have been able to take advantage of it? Great. Is this something that works for the restaurant industry? And and not just restaurants, but also retail, just like other frontline, other folks with frontline workers. And so I just, so this type of conversation is really important to us as we're trying to wrestle with, okay, if there was an optional pilot program created like this, what would need to be done to either make it meaningful to your workers and to make it feasible for you to take advantage of it?
Gotcha.
So anyway, if other people have thoughts too, but I think Janie, hearing your thoughts is really helping me shape and think through like, if whether it's us or whether it's another group that decides to kind of take this on, what would we want to add to it, take away from it, turn it into something that we'd actually want to use?
I think the other thing is, I don't see the state investing in something like this if it's not going to an accredited, maybe even a quality rated childcare provider, right? Which I flagged because I know many of our employees, even with financial assistance, are going to have a hard time accessing those programs, right? Because of wait lists, because of cost, et cetera. So I don't say that to pour cold water on the idea. I just say that, that's both a blessing and a curse, and that it means we're investing in quality childcare. The downside of that is maybe it makes it a little more difficult for some to access. which is always a challenge in this space. We want quality, but we want access at the same time. All right, let's keep going just because it's 10:30. We can always come back to this, but I want to make sure we at least hit all four. I put in here the Dallas Chambers slide again, but I think we've kind of covered that. So the third could potentially tie in to the conversation we just had, which is franchise tax credits. There have been some ideas floated, some conversations around, could we provide employers a franchise tax credit to offset certain investments in childcare? So unlike the tax programs we talked about earlier, this would be a state tax credit. My initial concern was, oh gosh, how many people actually pay the franchise tax? Because the legislature has increasingly increased the, I'm saying this poorly, but the legislature has increasingly lessened the number of businesses that have to pay the franchise tax. And getting feedback from many of y'all, I've been surprised how many restaurants are paying the franchise tax, which now that I think about it, actually makes sense because y'all are a high volume, low profit margin business, and franchise tax is based on gross receipts, right? But one interesting thing is this could be paired with something like a tri-share model where, yes, the employer has to put up some money, but maybe there's a way for them to recoup some of that cost through a franchise tax credit. So thoughts on this concept as a standalone and or in combination with something like tri-share?
Hey, if there was a franchise tax credit for us, I would be all over this. Absolutely would do it because we pay a huge amount of franchise tax. And so to be able to get some of that back and give it directly to our employees for childcare is a no-brainer. I mean, I think that would be a great solution. And I think you'd have a lot more participation from the restaurant industry if it was given back to them in some type of tax write-off.
Yep.
Agreed.
We love this the best. Kelsey, can we make this happen? It'd be great.
There's certainly a chance. It appeals to conservatives, as you would guess. You know, I think it all comes down to the dollars and cents and what we can get the legislature to pay for. But other states have done it, and I think there's some room there. You know, the one drawback, although it might not be a drawback for our industry, and we're not the only people who's on the call, but you know, a lot of small businesses don't pay the franchise tax, so this isn't going to help them. But a lot of industries do, right? We've got manufacturers on here, hospitals. I mean, there's a lot of industries that do pay the franchise tax that would really stand to benefit from this. So I think it's certainly worth considering.
Who's not paying the franchise tax, and how do I get to do that business?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
I was
basically
wondering about
companies
that.
making less than $2.47 million a year. So it's truly your small, low volume businesses, but that is 95% of Texas businesses. But you think about all the CPA firms out there, the small law firm, right? All the kind of smaller operators who have way less overhead and way less expenses, and maybe don't need the same access to childcare.
Correct.
And that's off the top line.
Yep.
So Kelsey, I'll just say that you'd have to do some sort of cap to limit your fiscal note. You know, it's because otherwise the LBB and the comptroller's office will hike it up so high that it wouldn't be feasible.
I think that's right, Mike. So one of the questions I have on here is, does it max out per employer, right? So you'd probably have some kind of calculation. You get X number of dollars that you spend per employee capped out at X, because yeah, you think about like Amazon, for example, if they did something like this, their franchise tax credit could be millions and millions of dollars, and that's not going to work, right? So having some kind of ceiling, I think, is probably what makes sense. So everyone can benefit from it, but everyone's going to hit a limit where this is as much as you're going to be able to get, because to Mike's point, the legislature is not going to fund this to the tune of, billions of dollars. Yeah, Adam.
One of the cons is ongoing state expense. Is there one that, is there a solution that isn't an ongoing state expense? I know I missed the first 20 minutes of the meeting, but I haven't noticed. That's a con for all of them, right?
The next one, sort of not, but
okay.
Yes, your point is well taken.
And then for this, is there conversation around what making sure, how do we make sure that we're not paying for employees that were already affording childcare?
That's a good question. I'd be curious to hear this group's thoughts on that. My thought is it'd be hard to carve them out, because then you're kind of penalizing them for doing the right thing or what we want them to do from the jump, right? So I would think you kind of need to be equal, and everyone who does whatever X is, invests X in childcare, qualifies moving forward. But curious what other people think about that.
Adam, I'm curious about your question. Sorry, just to add, just to ask sort of a clarification there. Are you just thinking that with the franchise tax? Or are you thinking that across all of them? All of these different asks?
Well, since this one is so limited, is limited to 5% of businesses. I don't know what the, you said 95% of small businesses don't pay the franchise tax, but that's not just, I don't know what the percentage is for restaurants that don't pay the franchise tax. So since is going to the people who most need it, and that it's not that it doesn't end up just being a break for high volume for businesses, that that it doesn't end up just being a tax break for businesses that are paying for their employees who are already paying for childcare.
Well, I don't know any restaurateurs that are paying for childcare.
No, I don't.
That can really afford it. It doesn't matter if you make over 2.5 million. If your expenses are, I mean, if you look at what a restaurant makes, and maybe that's part of what we need to do, is educate people in terms of, it's 7%. What do we talk about, Kelsey, at the TRA meeting? I mean, what a restaurant actually makes. You have so many expenses that, I hear what you're saying. You don't want somebody who's already doing it to get that benefit. But I think that there's a whole lot of people who would do it, who have not been able to afford it. And it would be a great opportunity to offer that to an employee.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that the restaurants are already providing it. I'm sure that I don't know of any restaurants that are already providing childcare. I meant that it would be a tax you would get your employees who were already paying for childcare. I'm not saying this is even a bad thing. I like the idea of this. I just want to also make sure that
if I get the
small
world
carve-out.
of scarcity, if we have a limited amount of resources, we want to make the dollars that we're going to spend go towards new childcare availability, not right. So hearing that and understanding it, it is difficult. The policy levers we have to do so are very difficult. If you say, oh, well, only people who aren't currently doing it right now would be able to do it, people can probably get around that by switching jobs. And so now you have created a incentive for you to leave your current employer to become a new employee. That's not necessarily a great solution. There are ways that you could theoretically do it that would be income restricted. So the benefit would only be available to people of a certain income, but now it would be difficult for the employer to verify what the household income is, as opposed to simply what their own income is that they're paying that employee. So there are some things that we can do there, but it is difficult from either an employer or because Texas doesn't have a state income tax for the state to do those sorts of limitations here. And that is kind of a unique Texas problem with the lack of that state income tax. There are other states that have it, but a lot of the times when we look at how do we target the money to the folks who need it, we do have difficulty putting those policy levers into place here.
I'll say too, Adam, I think the key is an employer has to take on some expense to qualify. So you can't just rely on your employees paying for their childcare to get the tax credit. The employer would have to do something to qualify, right? And so that would be an ongoing, whether you've done it in the past or not, you can't just rely on what your employees are paying to qualify, right? The employer would have to have some skin in the game to get that money.
That makes sense. And I want to make sure I'm not opposed to this at all. So I think Charles did a really good job of summing up my haphazard thoughts.
Totally get it. Any other thoughts on how we might need to structure this? It sounds like it's popular, so I'm now phrasing it as how we do it versus if we do it. All right, great. We'll keep moving. Okay, so lastly is kind of a new concept. I shared a one-pager on this with y'all via email. There is a project in Tarrant County. They used some of their federal COVID dollars to create this childcare expansion pilot program. And so basically what they did is they had a competitive process. They awarded grants to existing high quality childcare providers to basically stabilize them and help them expand in very targeted ways that meet the local workforce needs. That program had a lot of success. And so now they're looking at, can we expand this in other places across the state? So you can see here, $50 million would fund 3 to 4 pilots. And the idea is to have an urban area, a suburban area, a rural area, right? Make sure that we have diverse sort of geography and regions. I'll say I love this idea because it's really the only idea I've heard that actually speaks to expanding the number of childcare slots that we have in the state of Texas, which to me, until we address that, dealing with affordability and quality and all of these other issues are great, but you're limited in how much of an impact that can have if someone just purely cannot get their kid in a childcare center because there's no open slot, right? So this is one idea I think is worth considering, especially because, again, the idea is that these grants are specifically going to go to providers that can meet the local workforce needs. So for example, let's say Austin applies. They say, we are hearing from our employers that non-traditional hours care is a huge unmet need. Here are some providers that have already demonstrated they can serve that need. So we're going to give them a grant to make sure that they are more stable. And part of that is making sure they pay their workers enough so they will stay. I think Janie or someone mentioned that earlier. And then as part of that grant, the childcare provider has to meet certain requirements and they have to work with the grantor to expand to meet that specific need. Unlike some of the others, this technically is a one-time funding ask, right? Because it's a pilot. It's specifically about 3.5 years in its duration, and then it would end. We would probably come back and say, look how successful this was. Let's do it again. So that's why I say it's technically a one-time ask, and the legislators will know that. But still, it is technically a one-time ask. And the other kind of thought on this is it could help inform kind of larger changes and innovations down the road once we get some of the governance and other pieces, more tightly aligned. So in terms of kind of the pros and cons of this, I think the immediate con that comes to mind is this isn't statewide, right? This isn't something that every employer is going to benefit from. It's truly a pilot in a few regions across the state. Certainly acknowledge that. But the idea is that we kind of learn from it and do continue to expand it across the state. I think I kind of already talked about the pros. And those key questions are really from the franchise tax slide, so ignore those. So any thoughts, questions, feedback on this idea? Adam, this would be funded from the legislature. So they would just add it to their budget. The idea is $50 million would do 3 to 4 pilots. $100 million would do more like 7 pilots. So it would kind of depend on how much money the state would be willing to chip in.
When you say pilot, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like facilities, or because $50 million seems like a lot for 3 or 4 like childcare places?
Good question, Janie. So to clarify, it would be 3 or 4 areas that would participate, and then there would be multiple providers selected in that area.
Okay, sorry.
So somewhere I
Maybe
have
maybe that was a dumb question.
No, it wasn't. I'm glad you asked. So the Tarrant County folks estimate that would serve 72 childcare programs per year, creating approximately 5,472 seats. So yeah, 3 or 4 locations, and then there would be multiple providers within that location.
So then theoretically $100 million would add an additional 10 to 12,000 seats.
I'm not sure those would all be added seats because part of it is stabilizing. So that's a good question, is kind of the breakdown of new versus stabilized. In Tarrant County, they did find that these grants lowered tuition for private pay families at these providers. So there's kind of both benefits, new seats, cheaper seats that already existed. But I think that's a good question of kind of, what can we expect in terms of true new seats from that kind of investment?
And what's the innovation? Why is this a pilot? What are we showing that we don't already know through this?
I'll jump in on that one, Sandy. So one of the things that I am particularly interested in this is that it's two things, Sandy, to your question. One, what I love about this is that this is, it would be a competitive grant process for quality providers who are looking to expand what they're currently doing. So that could include expanding to infant toddler care. It could mean expanding to non-traditional hour care. But this has to be in their application, if you will, would be in response to the area's needs. And that they would apply for this through their workforce boards, basically, to say, hey, here's what we're thinking to do. Here's what we want to do. The grants that they would receive could be used for, well, there would be certain requirements they have to be used for, and then they can be used for a certain thing. So they have to be used for increasing the pay for the people who work there. It could be used for expanding facilities. So that's a really big deal, actually, because right now the money that TWC puts out through the workforce boards, that money cannot be used for actual buildings, but these grants could be used to improve. So let's say you wanted to offer non-traditional hour care, but you don't have the space. This would give you, this grant would give you as a provider the opportunity to, expand your building to provide the space that would be needed. And because based off of demand and surveys that you've done in the area, that you've got enough employers that actually need that care, you sort of prove that out in your request, and then you would be able to be eligible to receive the grant. So I think that's a big deal here. The other thing, and Sandy, I think you'll understand this because you've been in this space for a while and know how hard it is to get money into childcare. This is sort of a sneaky way of doing that, to be honest, because there's lots of requests year after year to fund the wait list. We need to give more money into the system and fund the wait list. But that is actually just helping with the demand that we already know is there. Nothing is happening with the supply side and actually building up more helping providers have stability in their, and we've talked about increasing funding and wages for the employees that work there at those childcare centers. This money would help on that supply side, helping ensure that we've got providers who are the teachers who are well paid enough to stay, and it helps the providers to expand into areas that we keep hearing from all y'all actually about that we know that we know families need, but there's not enough of right now.
What about utilizing the current existing facilities that are doing the pre-K and using them for after hours evening care and weekend care? I mean, those are usually open Monday through Friday. They close at a certain time. What if we were able to, I mean, they already have these facilities. I know in San Antonio, we built some really beautiful facilities for the pre-K. And they're not utilized on the weekends, and they're not utilized, in the evenings. And so, what if there was a way to tap into that for extended hours and care?
I think a couple challenges with that, Lupita, both of which could be addressed through something like this, right? So one, we hear consistently that the challenge is staffing more than facilities, right? Especially during non-traditional hours. Y'all know how it is in the restaurant world, trying to get people to work non-traditional hours, much less for $12 an hour. So that's one. The second is sometimes those buildings don't meet the minimum standards depending on the age group of childcare that you're trying to serve, right? So they have to have exterior facing doors, things like that, that sometimes those buildings that are built for one purpose aren't going to immediately translate. Now, sometimes that can be fixed with some kind of remodel, which to Wendy's point, all those federal funds cannot be used for any of that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's, into Sandy's question, that's where innovation comes in this pilot program. The idea is you childcare providers go work with your local employers, tell us what the needs are and how you can creatively meet those needs if you're given some money, right? If we can give you some money to help you overcome these hurdles, how can you do something innovative to actually address the local needs? So I think that would be a fantastic project in San Antonio, would be to say, here's an existing successful provider. They need another facility. They need some more educators to add on this shift or this special service. Here's what we need to get it done. And then if that's one of the best grant proposals that's put forward, it's funded. We give them a couple years to see how it works. And then we learn from that and can hopefully then do it somewhere else, right?
I mean, because if you think about it, the restaurants, when are they the busiest? It's the weekends. And childcare facilities aren't even open on the weekends. And so it's really tough, the weekends and sometimes in the evenings, but especially the weekends. And so if there was a way to tie into an existing program to be able to do that, but you would have to probably pay a premium for those workers who are willing to work in the evening. But we do it, I mean, we do it in our, anyone who works the swing or the late night shift, we already pay a premium to them because we know we can't find them employees to do it unless we pay a premium.
And that's where partnering with the employer in that application process is really key, and making sure that grant proposals that show that strong partnership are going to be the ones that rise to the top, because it's not only paying them a premium, but it's knowing for sure, okay, if we create this evening shift, we're going to have enough kids to make it financially successful, right? And so if you have that partnership from the beginning, you've identified the need, you've identified how you're going to meet it, you put those two together, that's a grant that's worth funding, right? Megan, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to say something?
Hi, yes, Megan Morrow here with Texas Association of Business. Some of you all, I haven't, but I just wanted to make a few comments, and thanks Kelsey and Wendy and Charles for all of your work on this. One is I dropped a child care tax credit deck that the Florida Chamber of Commerce advocated for this past legislative session that has some ideas on what that could potentially look like in Texas as a tool. And I really view all of these things as tools that employers could use, not one or the other. Like, I think the tri-share model is helpful for especially some of the larger employers that can budget for this, but also in conjunction with the franchise tax credit, child care tax credit that could be helpful for some of the smaller businesses, but we also need to look like how we make it more affordable generally for these childcare facilities to run. But I thought with the childcare tax credit in Florida, the actual facilities also get a credit as well. So there's some ways to promote those potential solutions to the legislature as well. And then as far as the employer partnership possibilities in the pilot programs, I think if there's some type of study tied to this, that way after these grants are received and the state has allocated 50 million to the different programs in different areas, we can go back the next session and say, and look at this productivity and economic outcome that was produced because of the availability of childcare. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think economists might. But maybe have that somewhere in there just so we can protect the funding. And then I think that hits a point too that someone else made that was a good point on, you know, the legislature is hesitant and taxpayers to see continuous funding that the state's committed to, but if it's producing and saving money from economic output, that's a way to help tie in this funding and keep it stable. And so those are my only comments on everything, but I'm looking forward to working with this group.
Thanks, Megan. I love part of the grant funding would go towards studying and reporting metrics and that kind of thing, but I don't think we had thought about kind of looking at the economic impact of those grants. I love that. I think that's a great call out. All right, so we're almost out of time, so I'll just kind of put all four back on here. Megan did a good job of kind of tying them all together for us. But any other closing thoughts on how we think about these things together or as a menu of options, etc.?
Wasn't there something we talked about one time about if an employee of a childcare provider also had a child in that facility, like the state helped fund that, or they were free or something like that? That seems like a way to incentivize, because I know obviously if I was working somewhere and my child was with me, like I would, particularly if I wasn't paying to have my kid there, like I'd be like, yes, I'm in.
Yes. Yeah. So Janie, that's under a different bucket. That's I forgot what we called it, our workforce bucket. But yes, that's still something we plan to support. The idea is not so much funding, but if a childcare teacher qualifies for the subsidy, which they almost all do because they're paid not a ton, they would get priority access to one of those subsidies because many times it's a multi-year wait list for a subsidy. So they would kind of jump the line and be able to access that subsidy and hopefully stay with that childcare provider and make sure seats, we don't lose seats because they have to leave to take care of their own kid. So yes, that's still very much something we plan to support, just not under this employer partnership bucket.
Got it.
And Wendy's really leading the work on that. All right, well, we're at time, so I'll just remind everyone of our next steps. There's really nothing new here, but please take the survey if you haven't already. Please continue the feedback. I think I'm going to come up with some questions for those who couldn't join us today. Maybe they can answer via email. But as y'all can hopefully tell, we really want these priorities to be driven by what's going to work for business. So please continue to keep that feedback coming. And then keep encouraging people to join. We actually had two business groups join E4C today. So we're still actively growing and recruiting, and y'all are helpful in that process. So unless there are any final questions, I think we're gonna kind of end right on time.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thanks, guys. All right, we'll talk soon.
Thank you.